On the night of the 27th of February 1939, flames rose above the village of Borley in rural Essex. The rectory beside the church, a sprawling Victorian building with over 30 rooms, was burning. Villagers gathered in the darkness as the fire tore through the structure. Some would later say they saw figures moving inside the flames. Others claimed they saw something standing among the ruins after the fire. By morning, the building that had become known across Britain as the most haunted house in England was a shell. Walls blackened, chimneys standing alone. The rectory was destroyed. But the story of Borley had been building for decades, and the fire would only make it harder to forget. Because long before the blaze, people had claimed that something else lived inside that house. Something unseen, something restless, and perhaps something that had been there long before the rectory itself was built. Welcome back to the Eclectic, the place where history, mystery, and the unexplained intersect. Each episode we explore stories that sit somewhere between documented fact and human imagination. Sometimes those stories involve crime, sometimes folklore, and sometimes they exist in the uneasy space between the two. Tonight's story takes us to a quiet English village, a Victorian rectory beside an ancient church. A place where generations of residents reported footsteps in empty corridors, bells ringing with no one there to pull them, and a silent figure walking the garden path. Over time, the house would become famous, investigated by paranormal researchers, reported in national newspapers, and debated for decades by believers and skeptics alike. Some people would call it the most haunted house in England. Others would call it one of the most elaborate ghost stories ever told. This is the story of Borley Rectory. The story begins long before ghost hunters, newspaper reporters, or paranormal investigators arrived in the village. In 1841, the original rectory that stood beside Borley Church burned down. Rectories were often the homes of parish priests, large houses designed not only for the clergy, but also for visiting parishioners and community life. When the first rectory was destroyed, the site remained empty for some time. In the early 1860s, a new rector arrived in Borley, Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, and he planned to build something much larger. In 1862 to 1863, construction began on a new rectory beside the church. It was large, usually large for a rural parish. The reason was simple. Reverend Bull had 14 children. To house such a family required space, and a great deal of it. The new rectory eventually grew to contain more than 30 rooms, with corridors, staircases, and extensions added over time. Its appearance was striking. Tall brick walls, long windows, a somewhat Gothic atmosphere that made it stand out beside the quiet village church. For the Bull family, however, it was simply home, at least at first. Even before the rectory gained its reputation, there was already a story attached to the land, a local legend. According to the tale, the area around Borley had once been home to a Benedictine monastery. In this story, a nun from a nearby religious house fell in love with a monk connected with the monastery. The two planned to escape together. They were discovered. The monk, according to the legend, was executed. The nun was said to have suffered an even darker fate, bricked up alive within the walls of a building, left there to die, and condemned to wander the grounds forever. It is a haunting tale, romantic, tragic, memorable. But historians have never found solid medieval records confirming that such a monastery existed at Borley. The story appears to have emerged much later, most likely during the Victorian period. Yet once a story like that attaches itself to a place, it becomes difficult to remove. Over time, the legend of the sorrowful nun became inseparable from Borley. The Bull family lived at Borley Rectory from the early 1860s until 1927. more than 60 years. During that time, the house became known locally for strange stories. But it's important to understand something. Much of what we know about those early hauntings was not written down at the time. Many of the accounts only appeared decades later, often repeated by later researchers or retold by people remembering events long after they happened. That makes it difficult to separate direct experience from family lore. Still, several recurring stories appear again and again. The nun on the path. One of the most famous sightings involved a figure in the garden, a woman dressed in grey, resembling a nun. She was said to walk a particular path beside the rectory garden. Over time, that path became known as Nun's Walk. According to several of the Bull daughters, the figure appeared silently, often at twilight, occasionally in daylight. In one story from the summer of 1900, 4 of the Bull sisters reportedly saw the figure moving along the path. But before they could reach her, the woman seemed to fade away among the trees. Whether apparition, misidentification, or childhood imagination, the story spread. And once people begin expecting to see something, they often do. Another recurring story from the Bull era involves something quite different. Not a figure in the garden, but the sound of a coach approaching the rectory. Reverend Henry Bull himself was said to have heard horses and wheels on the lane at night. At least once, he reportedly claimed to have seen something extraordinary. An old-fashioned carriage driven by 2 headless men, passing along the road before disappearing. Later, his son, Reverend Henry Harry Bull, who succeeded him as rector, also claimed to have seen a phantom coach near the rectory grounds. Such stories may sound dramatic today, but in rural Victorian England, ghost stories were part of everyday folklore, shared in households, repeated among neighbours, retold across generations. Not all the strange reports involved apparitions. Many involved simple disturbances, footsteps in empty corridors, knocking sounds, servants' bells ringing when no one had pulled them, doors rattling, windows shaking. Large Victorian houses often produce such noises naturally. Timber expands and contracts, old pipes shift, wind travels through long corridors. But when a house already has a reputation, those sounds take on a new meaning. Finally, visitors claimed experiences of their own. In 1885, a man named P. Shaw Jeffrey later reported that stones had been thrown while he was visiting the rectory. He believed the stones had been thrown by an unseen force. Other guests mentioned unexplained disturbances. A former school headmaster reportedly said he had seen a ghostly nun near the house on several occasions. But not everyone agreed. Several members of the Bull family later insisted that they had never seen anything unusual during their time living in the rectory. This difference of testimony would become a pattern throughout Borley's history. Some witnesses claimed extraordinary experiences. Others, living in the same space, reported nothing at all. Reverend Henry Bull died in 1892. His son, Reverend Harry Bull, took over the parish and continued living at Borley Rectory. The house remained in the Bull family for decades. During that time, the ghost stories never entirely disappeared, but they also never exploded into national fame. They stayed local, part of the village gossip, shared quietly among neighbours and visitors. It would take the arrival of a new family in 1928 to change that completely. When Reverend Harry Bull died in 1927, that long chapter ended. The house passed to a new rector, Reverend Guy Eric Smith. In 1928, he and his wife moved into the rectory beside the church. At first, they knew little about the stories surrounding the house. To them, it was simply an unusually large, somewhat gloomy Victorian building. It did not stay that way for long. The Smiths reported that strange things began happening not long after they moved in. They heard footsteps in empty corridors, Doors seemed to open or close on their own. Lights appeared where there should have been darkness. Bells rang in rooms where no one stood near the servants' bell pulls. There were also reports of a phantom carriage seen near the Rectory lane, and at least one sighting of a headless figure. Taken alone, each incident might have been dismissed as imagination, coincidence, or the ordinary noises of an aging building. Taken together, they created an atmosphere that made the house feel deeply uncomfortable. The Smiths began to believe that the stories told by the Bull family might not have been exaggerations. One incident in particular became widely repeated. Mrs. Smith reportedly opened a cupboard in the rectory and found something unexpected. Inside was a human skull wrapped in paper. It was described as belonging to a young woman. No clear explanation was ever given for how it came to be there. Whether the skull truly dated from centuries earlier or had a more mundane origin has never been firmly established. There is no definitive link between it and any specific person. But its discovery added a powerful new element to Borley's reputation. There was a physical object, a reminder that the house might be connected to a darker past. In 1929, the Smiths made a decision that changed everything. They contacted a national newspaper, the Daily Mirror. At the time, newspapers were increasingly interested in hauntings and unexplained events. Such stories drew readers. Borley Rectory sounded like the perfect headline. The paper sent a reporter to investigate. With that visit, the quiet village rectory became a national curiosity, and the Daily Mirror brought someone else with them, a man who would become permanently linked with Borley's legend. The reporter introduced the Smiths to Harry Price. Price was a well-known psychical researcher. He had investigated many supposed hauntings and paranormal events across Britain, and he understood the value of documentation and publicity. Price agreed to visit Borley Rectory. During his short investigation, he and several others present claimed to witness unusual events. Small stones thrown across rooms, objects moving unexpectedly, what sounded like poltergeist-like activity. For believers, these events confirmed that the house was genuinely haunted. Critics, they suggested something else, that someone present might have been staging the activity, whether deliberately or playfully. The truth remains unclear, but one thing is certain. The Daily Mirror coverage did its job. Borley Rectory was now famous. The Smiths did not stay long. The strange experiences, combined with sudden national attention, made life at the rectory uncomfortable. By mid-1929, they left. Finding a new rector willing to live there proved difficult. The rectory's reputation was spreading far beyond the village. Eventually, another clergyman agreed to take the position, a man who had become central to the most dramatic period in Borley's history. In October 1930, Reverend Lionel Algernon Foster moved into Borley Rectory. He was accompanied by his wife Marianne and their adopted daughter Adelaide. Foster was a cousin of the Bull family, so he already knew something of the house's reputation. But the experiences that followed would go far beyond the earlier stories. Almost immediately, the Foster family began recording disturbances. Servants' bells rang with no one touching them. Loud knocks echoed through the house. Objects moved or vanished. Footsteps sounded in empty rooms. Sometimes the disturbances happened in the day, sometimes late at night. For Marianne Foster, the experiences were particularly disturbing. She reported being pushed, slapped, and physically harassed by unseen forces. Some incidents allegedly left visible marks. Such reports pushed Borley's story into far more dramatic territory. The haunting, it seemed, had moved from strange sounds to something aggressively personal. One of the most unusual claims during the Foster period involved messages appearing on the walls, words written in pencil or scrawled across surfaces. Some of the messages addressed Marianne by name, others seemed to plead for help. A frequently repeated phrase asked for light, mass, prayers, and incense. For believers, these writings appeared to connect the haunting directly to the old legend of the sorrowful nun, the spirit begging for religious rites that might release her. The skeptics, the explanation was simpler. Someone in the house wrote the messages. Many later critics believed that someone was Marianne. When researchers later examined the Foster period, they noticed a pattern. Many of the strange events centered on Marianne. She was often the person who discovered objects had moved. She was frequently present when disturbances occurred. Several of the wall writings were directed specifically to her. There were also reports of tension within the household. Reverend Foster's health was poor. Parish work and the domestic pressure weighed heavily. Some investigators suggested that the haunting may have been exaggerated, or even staged during this time, perhaps as a way of expressing distress within the family or attracting help. But like so much at Borley, that explanation remains debated. At one point, Reverend Foster reportedly attempted a form of exorcism in the house, hoping religious ritual might end the disturbances. If anything, the strange reports continued. Foster kept notes about events and later sent accounts to Harry Price and to members of the Society for Psychical Research. Borley Rectory was no longer just a rumoured haunted house. It had become a formal case study. By 1935, the Foster family had had enough. They left the rectory. The disturbances, the attention, and the strain of living in such an atmosphere had become too much. Once again, the parish struggled to find someone willing to live there. Eventually, the building stood empty. For most houses, abandonment marks the end of a story. But for Borley Rectory, it marks the beginning of its most famous investigation. By the mid-1930s, Borley Rectory stood empty. For Harry Price, this empty, notorious house represented an opportunity. He had first visited during the Daily Mirror coverage years earlier. Now he wanted something more ambitious: time and control. In May 1937, Price arranged a 1-year tenancy of the rectory. Instead of a brief visit, he would conduct a long-term investigation. His goal was to observe the house systematically, document what happened there, and decide whether Borley Rectory really deserved its reputation. Recruiting observers. Price placed advertisements looking for volunteers. Students, curious members of the public, anyone willing to spend nights in a building many already believed was haunted. Over time, around 40 to 50 volunteers took part. They stayed in shifts, usually over weekends. Each person received instructions to record anything unusual. Every sound, every sight, every disturbance. On paper, it looked like a controlled experiment. In practice, it was far less tidy. The building was old, drafty, and full of long corridors and unfamiliar rooms. Volunteers were often young, eager, and primed to experience something extraordinary. Under those conditions, even ordinary noises could become something more mysterious. During Price's tenancy, a wide range of experiences were recorded. Some observers heard footsteps in empty corridors. Others described knocking sounds in distant rooms. A few reported cold spots in certain areas of the house. There were occasional claims of unexpected lights or small objects shifting position. None of these reports amounted to clear, conclusive proof of the paranormal, but together they reinforced the atmosphere that had surrounded Borley for decades. Something about the house unsettled people, whether through psychology, architecture, or something else. Later, critics would point out something important. Borley Rectory was an enormous ageing Victorian building. The structure itself could produce strange effects. Wind moving through chimneys and corridors could create knocking sounds. Temperature differences between rooms could produce sudden cold patches. Wooden beams expanded and contracted. Old plumbing rattled. And when people stay overnight in an unfamiliar building already famous for ghosts, perception changes. Every creak becomes suspicious. Every shadow seems to move. Expectation shapes experience. In 1940, Harry Price published a book about the rectory with a dramatic title, The Most Haunted House in England. The book became a bestseller, bringing Borley Rectory to a national audience. From that point on, the village's name was permanently tied to paranormal legend. Price did not claim absolute proof of ghosts, but he presented the events at Borley as deeply mysterious. For many readers, the conclusion was obvious. The house must be haunted. By the late 1930s, Price's tenancy ended and the rectory was sold. The new owner was Captain W. H. Gregson. Gregson moved into the house in 1938 and planned to renovate and restore it. Those plans would never be completed. Less than a year later, the rectory caught fire. On the night of the 27th of February 1939, flames spread through the house. The fire reportedly began after Gregson accidentally overturned an oil lamp while unpacking books. The blaze moved quickly through the building's wooden interior. Despite efforts to control it, the rectory was badly damaged. Walls remained, chimneys stood, but the structure itself was gutted. Even as it burned, the house's reputation coloured how people saw events. Some locals later claimed they saw figures moving in the flames. Others believed they glimpsed shapes among the smoke. Whether those sightings were real, imagined, or shaped by expectation is impossible to know. But the legend grew. After the fire, Borley Rectory stood as a burned-out ruin. For several years, the empty shell attracted visitors, ghost hunters, curious travellers, local villagers. Stories circulated that strange figures were still seen around the ruins, that lights appeared where there was no electricity, that something still lingered among the broken walls. Eventually, the decision was made to demolish the structure entirely. In 1944, the remains of Borley Rectory were cleared away. The house that had once dominated the landscape was gone. The story was not. Before demolition, Harry Price returned once more. In 1943, while parts of the ruins still stood, he organised an excavation in the cellar area. During the dig, workers discovered human bones. The remains were incomplete. Some believed they might belong to the legendary nun from the old story. It was a dramatic discovery, and it seemed to connect the folklore of the sorrowful nun with something physical. But there was no reliable way to identify the bones. They could have come from a later burial or some entirely unrelated event. Human remains near old churches are not unusual. The bones were eventually buried in nearby Liston churchyard. The mystery stayed exactly that, a mystery. After Harry Price died, his work on Borley came under close scrutiny. Members of the Society for Psychical Research re-examined the case. 3 investigators in particular, Eric Dingwall, Kathleen Goldney, and Trevor Hall, played key roles. In 1956, they published a highly critical report. Their conclusions were blunt. They argued that many of the phenomena at Borley could be explained by trickery, exaggeration, or misinterpretation. Some disturbances, they suggested, might have been caused by residents or visitors. Others, by the natural behaviour of the building. They also suggested that Price may have been too eager to accept paranormal explanations and sometimes careless with his methods. For believers, the report seemed unfair, even hostile. For skeptics, it confirmed long-held suspicions that Borley Rectory's reputation rested as much on storytelling as on genuine mystery. Despite the criticism, the story of Borley Rectory did not disappear. If anything, the controversy helped keep it alive. Books continued to be written. Television programs revisited the case. Paranormal investigators travelled to the site. Today, very little remains of the rectory itself. The land is quiet, open, easy to overlook if you didn't know what once stood there. But the legend persists, because Borley sits at the intersection of several powerful human impulses. Our fascination with ghost stories, our desire to explain strange experiences, and our willingness to believe that certain places hold memories of what came before. Perhaps the most enduring image connected with Borley is still the silent figure walking the garden path. The nun, head bowed, moving slowly along the route that became known as Nun's Walk. In the legend, she is a woman punished for love, a tragic figure trapped between worlds. Historically, she is almost certainly a Victorian invention. But in folklore, truth is not always necessary. Stories endure because they resonate emotionally, and the image of the sorrowful nun wandering a quiet garden is hard to forget. Borley Rectory may never be fully understood. Perhaps it was genuinely haunted. Perhaps it was a mixture of suggestion, storytelling, and human imagination. Perhaps it was something else entirely. What we do know is that for nearly a century, people have returned to this story again and again, trying to decide whether Borley represents the supernatural or simply the extraordinary power of belief. Borley Rectory no longer stands beside the church in that quiet Essex village. The walls are gone, the rooms are silent, but the story remains, shaped by witnesses, investigators, newspapers, skeptics and believers. And like many mysteries that sit somewhere between folklore and fact, it continues to invite interpretation. Because sometimes the most interesting question isn't whether something supernatural truly happened. It's why people believe that it did, and what those beliefs tell us about the world we live in. You've been listening to The Eclectic, a place where history, mystery, and the unexplained collide. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.